From Los Angeles, the home of film and television, this is Film Music Live, a webcast featuring outstanding composers, orchestrators, filmmakers, and more from the world of music for film, television, and video games, talking about their work and answering your questions. Film Music Live is sponsored by the Film Music Network and Film Music Institute. And now the host of Film Music Live, Daniel Schweiger.
Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel Schweiger, and welcome to Film Music Live, the show where you get to ask the questions to today's top composers. I'm happy to have you here. Like so many composers who once labored in relative obscurity, former choir boy David Buckley provided assistance and additional music to Harry Gregson Williams on scores like Flushed Away, The Number 23, and Shrek the Third, before his own solo voice was finally heard with his big martial arts breakthrough with 2008's The Forbidden Kingdom. Gradually, Buckley became a go-to guy when you wanted characters on the run, from movies to video games, his rhythmic talents blasting through the town. From Paris with Love, Parker, Call of Duty Ghosts, Batman, Arkham Knight, and Jason Bourne, all while also showing a more sedately thrilling side with the TV series The Good Wife. Buckley's action-centric stylism has been more impressive than ever as he ranged between the propulsively patriotic suspense of Gerard Butler saving America again in Angel Has Fallen, the grinding metal of a psycho driver for Unhinged, and the emotionally apocalyptic music of a family trying to escape the end of the world in Greenland. Yet, the once anonymous Buckley has never quite had a scoring chase like Nobody. Think a seemingly schmucky, way-over-the-hill John Wick, and you'll get an idea of Bob Odenkirk's factory guy who starts off taking punches in a home invasion before turning out to be a CIA auditor with a very special set of skills that's soon devoted to making ironic mincemeat out of the Russian mafia. Directed by Russian hardcore Henry filmmaker Ilya Naishuller, Nobody is a punishingly delightful and unique spin on the invincible ex-hitman genre, especially in David Buckley's at-first unassuming approach. With the sad sax and woeful vibes, Buckley's succinct score conveys a sad, nowhere life. But when it finally comes time to kick ass and take names from the guy you'd least expect, Buckley rains down the rock and roll guitar hammer and slamming metallic beats for Hutch Mansell to take care of business. It's a score that gets across the exhilaration of a guy who's longed to flex his hidden muscles, yet delivering the melodic beat down with a very human poignancy for a true movie sleeper in every sense of the word and note. And now let's welcome a composer whose name you will definitely remember after watching Nobody, David Buckley.
Hey, Daniel. Lovely to be here.
It's great to have you here. So I guess let's start. Tell me about your journey from choir boy to destroying the Russian mafia.
That's as simple. It's an obvious one, isn't it? Like a few of my colleagues, we did start our lives in the choir stalls. Harry, my mentor, and his brother Rupert, Nick Glennie Smith, Henry and Jackman, many others. I've never really, there's probably a very good reason why, we left our choral world behind us and wanted to move into scoring direction, although I don't really know the answer myself. But it was actually because of my choir days where I met Harry. We were singing in the same choir, actually. He was a little bit older. I don't think he'd mind me saying that. A tad older. And he obviously, made his way from the UK to Hans, and, the rest is history for Harry. But I followed and sent him an email, when I had just turned, I think I was just about to turn 30, and saying, I'd love to see what this is all about. And Harry very graciously said, well, come on over and see what you think. And, it really was, I guess, a classic example of who you know. I happen to know someone who was doing rather well, and he remembered me from the old life, and gave me a shot, which I'll never forget.
So tell me, what were those early days like? Essentially trying to make a name for yourself.
What, when I first came over here to Hollywood? Well, when I arrived in LA, I didn't really necessarily think that I was going to become a film composer with my own name and my own career. I was quite happy with being in the trenches and, helping Harry out, here and there, getting some stuff over the finish line, and being what I would hope was a useful pair of hands. I didn't really think, I've never sort of, when I went to music college or even when I was in London before I moved to LA, I never thought I am a composer and this is what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my life. But it was, again, it was Harry. There was an opportunity that the film you mentioned, The Forbidden Kingdom, I was working for him at the time, and that job was sort of spoken about within his studio and he couldn't do it. And that was an opportunity for me to write a demo, to meet a director, Rob Minkoff, to meet a producer, Casey Silver, and sort of prove to partly myself, but to Harry and to these other people, whether I was a sort of legitimate candidate to even start scoring a film. I mean, let alone getting it over the finishing line, which I did. So and I think that things kind of evolved from there. I with that film being a success, I thought, oh, well, maybe this is something I can do. And, like anyone else, there's the ups and downs and the struggles and the self-doubt. But I think having that early break, I think about 18 months after I got to LA, it did give me some confidence.
So tell me, what were the initial action-oriented scores that you worked on? What were the things you learned about how to score the genre?
Well, I learned a lot from Harry. Harry's career, which I've always been envious of, because it straddles, on the one hand, the action and the thriller, perhaps epitomized more than any other relationship that he had. But I think the Tony Scott Harry one is one that I'm sure will always be dear to Harry's heart and to many other film fans who loved their collaboration. I know, on the other side, there was Harry writing Shrek and Flushed Away and Arthur Christmas, all these beautiful orchestral scores. So, I had this, even before I had reunited with Harry since a kid, I had this huge admiration that his career had this huge spectrum. And I'm mentioning sort of almost polar opposites. There's plenty in between as well. So when I arrived with Harry, and I think it was Flushed Away, which was a nice animated score that I was doing a little bit of work on. I remember Harry saying to me, Dave, I've got this Joel Schumacher film, number 23. Do you want to stick around a little longer and see if you can get dark and see if you can get propulsive and actiony and thrillery? And I guess it sort of worked. I guess it was something that I seemed to be able to do, so much so, in fact, that Harry put me forward to Joel as someone who could score his subsequent film, which Harry wasn't able to. So I learned, it really was a sort of learning on the job. I'd sit in Harry's room, I'd see how he'd utilize rhythm in a very clever way. And often, but also keeping a melodic fragment alive, not just thinking that this is, a rhythm track, but thinking, how do we also infuse this with an appropriate emotion? So, Harry was, as well as gracing me with some work and saying, Dave, can you work on this? I was also really learning some nuts and bolts sort of Harry-isms from my time with him, which I think in many ways sort of led me to my first solo action thriller score, From Paris with Love, which, I look back on that and I think that I don't think I departed in many ways too much from what I'd learned with Harry. I think that was basically all I was equipped with at the time. And I think I remember saying to Harry, I feel like it's a homage to what you do, Harry, or it's God, perhaps something worse. But it was my sort of first shot at a movie like that. And I think as I've progressed subsequently, as I've scored more action films, I've managed to sort of bring more of me into it, especially seeing as back then no one kind of knew who I was. The director on that probably actually would have liked Harry to have scored it, but so in some ways my job was to sort of do a Harry imitation. I think that can be one of the realities, I think, when you leave the camp, the stable of a big A-lister. If you've been working beneath them, there might be an expectation that you can do a version of what they do, albeit they'll pay you a lot less. Yeah.
Now I have to give a shout out, in terms of Joel Schumacher, who unfortunately just passed away. You scored one of my favorite vampire films ever. The film with the first ever Nazi vampires and vampire horse, Blood Creek.
That was a great experience for me. It was Forbidden Kingdom, and then it was Blood Creek. They were pretty much on top of each other, actually, which was a bit daunting for because I hadn't done this before. It wasn't here's a film, go and figure it out. It was suddenly here's two films, go and figure it out. Although I had Harry as a brilliant mentor to make sure that I didn't screw anything up too badly. But yeah, I loved that film, and I specifically loved the first reel, which was all shot in black and white. And I just regret that it's a bit anonymous and didn't really get the attention that I think it deserved, because I think it like so many of Joel's films, he had great sort of talent that wasn't necessarily particularly well known back then, is very well known now, and very interesting artistic take on things, and Nazi vampires. I mean, come on.
And now you're really on a roll with really rhythmic atmospheric scores like ATM, Gone. You're doing video games like Call of Duty Ghosts. What was, again, kind of developing that voice to the point where you get to Jason Bourne, which is like taking over the mantle of a score that really pretty much changed the entire face of how you score action?
Well, that was a tricky one, and I think your analysis is correct. I mean, I remember, I forget what year the first Bourne film was. What year was that? Would you say early 2000s?
Yeah. I don't have it in front of me, but around there, yeah.
And I remember watching that and just thinking, this is an art film. This isn't an action film. This is an art film, and this is an art score. I think by the time I came to the party with Jason Bourne, I think it had lost, not just musically, but I think in its overall sense, that sort of indiness, I think, had kind of expanded, as is the nature of many things which start kind of small and indie-ish and boutiquey. There tends to be they become a little bit more sort of studio and a little bit more flashy, I suppose, in some ways, glossy. But for me, it was really nice to play in that sandpit of John Powell's DNA, his musical DNA. That it is iconic. That theme, those themes have become, oft plagiarized by others, or certainly aped and imitated. It was kind of nice to be able to use that stuff and not feel like I was supposed to be doing that. That was my job. I have to say, though, it was also, when it was, the suggestion was brought forward that this is something I could do with John, I had to sort of wear a measured sort of hat for this as to what I could do and also what was expected of the music. And Paul Greengrass did say to me fairly early on that this is, for him, this is a sort of getting the band back together. And by that, he went, he even said, we've got the tunes, you know how they go, don't you, Dave? I said, yeah, I do. And he goes, well, I think that's what we really want for this. Now, I did try in the early part of doing it to sort of perhaps reimagine and reinterpret things a little bit more. But I think there was a sort of agreement, or it became sort of agreed that I needed to toe a little bit closer to the party line and get, give that sort of classic Bourne feel. And I have to say, as one of the outsiders, everyone else had done this a few times. It wasn't really my place to resist. I had to respect the opinions, and I dare say it was the right decision. But an interesting one to come into something which is so iconic, because your every fibre of your being says, "Oh, I want to play with this. I want to put it this way, turn it upside down, rip it apart, and do all that kind of stuff." And there was a limit to I think how far I could stray from what had already been set up by John. So I don't consider I did a lot of work on that score, but clearly the musical foundation comes from everything that John created, and it's very much his world in which I was allowed to come and enter for a brief while.
Well, I did a remarkable job with it, and we still have a couple of Nobody soundtracks to give out to our questioners, courtesy of Backlot Music. So I want to again jump right ahead into Nobody. Obviously Jason Bourne, that's a guy who can take care of himself. Someone breaks into his house, he's dead in about 10 seconds. But in terms of Nobody, again, it's you've seen this kind of movie. Like I didn't know he used to be the cook, or he was and this is literally a character that absolutely no one expects to have a very special set of mad skills. But again, having a guy like Bob Odenkirk, who's essentially a comedian before, Better Call Saul, kind of showed just how the range that he really had. What's the trick to scoring a guy like that who you really just cannot even begin to see as an action star?
Well, I think, I had to be careful because I didn't want to sort of I didn't want to make him look silly. Not that he did, Bob, I don't know, I think he's 58 maybe, and he's absolutely pulled this role off. I think it's a real achievement for him, and I think, I think I read somewhere that, or was told that he may have spent a couple of years training to get into shape for this. So I think he's totally legit. But what I didn't want to do was sort of score him in a way that would make him feel a little bit cheesy or a little bit, I didn't want it to be too wink with the music. So in many ways, what I felt I was scoring, or what perhaps in hindsight, I think it more than at the time, was the aggression of the movie, the visceral squalor of the violence, as opposed to, Bob's a badass with a guitar. Because, Bob is a badass, and yes, there is a guitar, but I think in many ways that sort of edgy, rocky kind of sound is more the violence that obviously that he wants to sort of bring onto the stage, in which he is a willing participant. But it is a tricky one with that, because you kind of think to yourself, well, and this is what I spoke with Ilya about before the film was even shot. What isn't the score? Well, we knew it wasn't an orchestral score, not just because it wasn't, a budget that necessarily lent itself to a full orchestra, but there was nothing about. I'd read the script at this point. Obviously, Ilya was, about to shoot the movie, so he had a kind of clear idea in his mind what was going to work and what wasn't. And there was just, neither of us felt any compulsion for orchestral gestures in this score, nor a piano. We did feel that some kind of edgy kind of guitar-based thing was probably going to work, and then we realized that when we started seeing the pictures and editing and everything. And of course, the other thing that I had to figure out, as much, the score is part of the movie, but the songs are a part of the movie as well, and in some way, give a spin on who Bob is and who's his character Hutch. So I had to also think about those, and those songs would change actually a little bit throughout the editing process. So I think that I've got like a cool thing working for Bob here, but then when the song next to it had changed, it could have messed things up a little bit. So I think it's giving. For me, it was the two main things that I wanted to find in terms of tone and theme is Bob's past and Bob's present. And his past, as we discover in this film, is this, lean, mean, violent man, albeit, under the auspices of the CIA. And his present is this sort of wistful, slightly broken, not quite functioning adult who's got this memory of the past, who's never really been able to let go of. So, that's why I appreciated this film, because, when you read a script and you kind of think, another thriller, another action kind of thing, you can think, how am I going to do it? How am I going to go around a scoring process again? But the complexity of Hutch's character was what immediately, sold the film to me as going to be something really unique, and also just that the process I felt was going to be fun and rewarding.
One thing I really love on the album is a sax. This and in the movie, he puts on the album, which is how you hear it. But I can't remember the last action film I've seen or action score that had the sax as an instrument in it.
Well, now I'm going to, sorry to be a slight stop. It's actually a muted trumpet, but I
mistake.
No, not at all. No, I can see how it could come across as that. So so this was his brother, and it's it's kind of obscure that his brother doesn't spend much time on screen. In fact, most of our time between Hutch and his brother is on phone calls. But the first time we were aware there's a phone call, there's his brother's got this brief sort of 10, 12-second moment of him playing an instrument. Now, originally in a temp, they just put a little bit, I think it was Spanish guitar. And there was an idea, well, why does he play the trumpet? And I thought, well, that's a pretty good idea. Why doesn't he play the trumpet? And then that little trumpet thing kind of lived as a lick, as a theme, a motif that could appear later and really rematerializes in the big set action piece at the end. But yeah, totally fun for me to kind of have guitars, synths, and a muted trumpet or sax, depending on how one listens to it.
Oh, cool. Now, the Russian mafia are essentially the bad guys du jour. They've been for a while. How do you put a different spin on this kind of portrait of the Russian mafia for this film?
Well, yeah, that's a good question, because you want to be careful that, he's already quite hammy, Julian, the mobster. There he is with his dancing to his sort of Euro cheese karaoke stuff, So, I didn't want to do I didn't want to go all Russian voices, although I will, it's funny, now I say that, and there is a moment in one of the scenes, it's quite a long talky scene between Hutch and Julian, where I do actually have Russian voices in there, sort of male voices, but I've sort of chopped them up, and they're stuttering as almost a rhythmic effect in the background. So actually, the net result is it doesn't actually matter that they're Russian voices or not. It humored me and it humored the Russian director. But yeah, I didn't want to go too far with it and make it, Hunt for Red October. It seemed that would be putting a hat on a hat. But I have my nod and a wink to it is a little bit of balalaika playing some tremolos, just to infuse some color at the right time and the right place without being heavy-handed. We wanted to be careful that we didn't push that stuff to so it became slapstick, because this film is riding a fine line between, in terms of, it is a violent film, but it is also a film which does, Hutch does have some morals. He's not completely without morals, and we just didn't want this to just sort of fall apart and as anything goes. And I think had I pushed an overtly ethnic Russian sound, people may have kind of started to roll their eyes as opposed to actually enjoy the offering.
Now, Stefan from YouTube has a question. Can you talk a bit about how no music can often be most effective in support of a scene? For instance, there is no music when Odenkirk gets on that bus before the beatdown madness ensues.
When I first watched the movie, thanks for your question, Stefan. When I first watched the movie, like very early days after they shot it, I think there was about 7 or 8 minutes of score in the entire film. And the reason they showed it to me wasn't to say, that's it, you just got 8 minutes. It was actually to say, where do you think we could add music? Where, what are your thoughts? Not necessarily on give us your score, but just like, do you think we should put something here? Do you think it should be here? And I'm a firm believer, Stefan, that it's finding space for silence, I think, is so important, because I think then when you get that downbeat, it means so much more. And I think we live in a world where we're sort of saturated by music. Everywhere you go, there is some kind of musical sound almost in the background. I mean, I went to the swimming pool this afternoon and endless music. So I think that the potency of music increases when you find those moments of silence. And I'm, it's not one trying to shirk from scoring I only want to write 30 minutes of music on this film. It's not that at all. It's that you want whatever amount of music you have to do to have the maximum impact. And I don't think you can get that if you're just in there all the time. It's an aesthetic choice as well. And obviously it depends on the movie. But Bob is so strong in this that there was never a moment where anyone said, where Ilya or a producer said, oh God, this scene, it's just not quite working. We really, you need to prop it up, or, it plays. It probably is the sort of movie where you could pull a lot of music out and it would still play great. I mean, hopefully the added layer, gives it that, proverbial icing on the cake. But it's a strong. I watched it without with those mere 8 minutes of music in, and it still played really well. But I think that we should all, whether producers, directors, we should all think about silence, because it's a profound effect, and it only makes when the music appears feel like an even more profound event.
Yeah, I mean, I just noticed this must be the most succinct action score I've heard in memory. I mean, I wanted more after I heard how good the album was. Like, okay, where's the other hour?
Well, to be fair, people differ on their opinion about this, but I've certainly in recent times, I see the soundtrack as its sort of own project. I don't just say, here's 1M1, the opening cue, and here's 5M40, and just plonk them all on there. I really edit them, and if there were things that I liked in the original thing, but you couldn't really hear it because it had to be dipped for dialogue or something. I accentuate that, and if there's 4 bars which I had to repeat because there was an edit, or there was some sort of a murmuring thing that worked great on screen, but it wasn't. I felt it could have. It was slightly treading water when you're just listening to it without visuals. I tightened the crap out of it. So I really do go through, possibly, to use a phrase from nobody, maybe I slightly overcorrected with this score because it is very, very taut. But anyway, if it leaves people wanting more, then I'm happy with that.
Now, here's a question from David Hand. 2 of my favorite soundtracks are The Forbidden Kingdom and Greenland. May I ask, what is the quickest you have had to compose a full soundtrack, and were you happy with the results?
Well, thank you for mentioning Forbidden Kingdom and Greenland. I liked both those processes. I think I can now remember the quickest. It was a TV movie called Killing Lincoln. No, not Killing Lincoln, Killing Reagan. I did 2 of these. It's the Bill O'Reilly Killing series, and the Killing Reagan was someone else was doing it, and there was problems, so I had to come in, and I was told, look, there's a week. I think the week ultimately became a luxurious 10 days, but that was, that was pretty brutal, because it was, I don't know, probably 70, 80 minutes of music, and I had to record strings on it at the sort of day 9 mixed data and hand it off. Was I pleased with it? I didn't really have, certainly at the time, I didn't have too much time to sort of do much self-analysis. I just had to kind of trust that I was moving things in the right direction, send stuff to the director, to the producer, get some reassurances, and keep moving forward. I've never watched it, the final thing. I think the music came out quite well. It's not an experience I'd probably want to do on a regular basis, but I know it's probably one of those things one might do in one's career once in a while, and it probably sharpens some muscles and skills that one didn't necessarily know one had or had been lying dormant. So that was the quickest. I mean, obviously doing TV, you're on a fairly rapid schedule, but in terms of movie, that was it was a TV movie, but it aspired more towards the status of a movie than a TV show, and that was by far the quickest schedule I've been on.
Now, from Sachi Danand, what are some of your favorite sample libraries for mockups?
Well, I mean, when I started my career, I sort of couldn't really afford anything. This is before I moved to Los Angeles. I scraped whatever I could find and begged, borrowed, and I shan't say stealed, but begged and borrowed, and went to other people's studios to check things out. And I suppose over the years, as I've got more successful, I've realizing that the mock-up process is actually, you can't really ignore it. I mean, you can't, these days, if you're playing something to a director or executives, they've got to hear something that sounds sort of legit, and that they don't have to use too much imagination. I mean, obviously, if it's a director you've worked with before, you start to get a shorthand. But if it's someone who you don't know, that first time you hit play, they've got to kind of understand what you can't just say, and then when we get the horns, it's going to sound great. They kind of need to hear the horns. So I suppose I've, looked at what does it for me. You can hear things online, and I don't think I've got any hidden gems. I mean, things like Spitfire orchestral tools, cine samples are all things that I've got in my template. What I would say is that I do pick and choose. I don't just have everything in there. In fact, I'm going through a process, or a sort of reductionist process, rather like my Nobody album, where I whittle it down from 45 minutes to 25. I'm doing that with my sounds as well, because I sometimes find it overwhelming, and I kind of think, why do I need 7 celestes or 12 harps or 15 accordions? I don't need 1 accordion in my template these days. But I try and listen to what's good, and by listening to demos and hearing what other people say, whittle it down and just get something that I know does the job for me and gets a demo sounding as good as the time that I think is worth spending on it. But I would also say that I'm also, and probably in the last year, have gone through a process of trying to make my own. Well, I've always made some samples, but really now trying to make samples that live in my template as my own. So I don't feel like, it's something that comes off the shelf. I'm not saying I'm trying to record an orchestra or anything like that. I'm not crazy enough to do that. But just sort of more, vocal sounds or cello sounds, things that are quite interesting, unusual, building up my own bank of those, so I can use them as I write, or, needs a little bit of inspiration. So trying to sort of address the balance between just buying something that kind of anyone can buy, should they have the money, and trying to get things that are sort of really specific to me, so I can have them as I want them.
Now, here's a question from Dale. Now, did Ilya Naishuller's groundbreaking music video background, which led to Hardcore Henry, plus the fact that he's also a musician, create a unique scoring process for Nobody?
Yeah, I mean, I had a great relationship with Ilya. We were only in the same room once, I think, when I went to Canada to spot the movie with him. And that was a great moment for us to, a great moment, an absolutely necessary moment for he and I to look each other in the eye and really try and understand, where we were both coming from for this film. And I was aware of his music, and, he spoke to me about his musical tastes, and not just things that he likes to do, but things, it's slightly unusual for a director to say, not only do I like this piece of music, but I also played on this piece of music, or I wrote this piece of music. So, I listened to what he'd done, and sort of just tried to enter his world so I could understand it. Not that he ever said, you've got to toe, the line that I've created, and this is what you must do. There was none of that. He was totally open for experimentation and discovery. I mean, I think, Ilya, I don't think he'd mind me saying this. This is, there's Hardcore Henry, and then there's Nobody, I think. I'm not sure there was anything before that. So he was quite keen for me to sort of say, well, I think it should be this, and I think it should be that. And he wasn't one of those directors who's just sort of saying, it's this is what you must do. It really was a nice collaboration. And I knew from Hardcore Henry that there was this sort of frenzy to his filmmaking, and that, almost video game like quality, which I think some of that lives on in Nobody as well. And the film itself, I mean, we talk about the album being, relatively concise. I mean, the film is concise as well. I think it's 88 minutes. It's all sort of taut and I think sort of every moment is sort of energized, and I think that's where we had this sort of consensus that we need to find this energy, the appropriate energy for each scene. But he was very, having said which, Ilya was also very considerate and thoughtful about the few moments, because we're talking about this film and its violence, and there is some brutal moments of violence. There's also quite hilarious moments of violence, if one can use hilarity and violence in the same sentence. But we spoke about the tender moments in this movie as well, Hutch and his relationship with his wife and with his daughter. And we took those with as much, we treated those as much respect as anything else. It wasn't just like an afterthought, we got to put a couple of saccharine notes on these bits because there's a lovey-dovey bit or an emotional bit. We really did try and look at every facet within the film and treat them all as seriously as they needed to be treated.
Now, Stephen Miller's got a question. what is your favorite instrument to compose for?
As of late, it's been the voice. And it kind of takes us back to the beginning of our conversation, Daniel. I mean, that's where my musical awakening happened with vocal music and the singing of vocal music. And I've been quite lucky that sort of in recent years, there's a score I wrote for the remake of Papillon, which again is a film that didn't get such a wide release. But I was able to use a boys' choir in that score, which, you know, for me, it was a sense of satisfaction. In fact, I say a boys' choir. It was a very boys' choir I sang in as a kid. I sort of went full circle. Just a little bit of history. When I was a boy in this choir, we sang on the score to The Last Temptation of Christ. So it was kind of nice for me, sort of 30 years after that, to go back there and say, hey, I now want you to sing on my score. So I really enjoyed that. And Rick Roman Waugh, who directed Angel Has Fallen and Greenland, he kind of got interested in me because of this Papillon score. And he said, you know, I'd love in Greenland if we could bring a similar sound of innocence for a world that's, you know, potentially about to kind of destroy, because, you know, get hit by a meteorite. Can you bring in that ethereal boy's voice? And I said, yeah, I'd love to do that again. So I think it just it's right. You know, I suppose if you're a guitarist by trade, you know, someone like Haytor, who's a guitarist, I imagine that a lot of his scores have guitar in them, and there's lots of composers who are pianists. I mean, I can dabble, you know, I can play a little bit of, like, I'm a reasonable pianist. I'm a terrible guitarist, but I'm also not a particularly great singer these days, but it is it's my roots. That's where it all began for me. And I think that music kind of, if there's a way of it coming out into a film score that makes sense, I mean, it would not have made sense in Nobody for me to have brought a boys' choir in. In fact, it would have got me fired from Nobody had I brought a boys' choir in. Maybe the sequel, who knows?
I mean, I just got to tell you how much I love Rick's movies. I mean, he made two of the best prison movies I've ever seen, with Snitch and Shot Caller, and really a pretty great sequel to the whole, you know, Angel Has Fallen that he scored in Greenland is really a terrific movie. You know, it's definitely a kind of a more realistic, if you will, you know, take on 2012.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I loved about Rick from the first conversation I had with him is, you know, which was for Angel Has Fallen, is he goes, you know, I want to, you know, there's an expectation for what this franchise is, but, you know, I want us to believe that Mike Banning, you know, I want to bring some believability to his character, and that it's not just playing the patriotic card. It's not to say that we completely throw that out the window, but you know, that we feel for him as a man and as a husband, because, you know, he's sort of advanced in where he is in the world, and he's got a daughter to care for, and that, you know, and that evolved very much into Greenland, where same, you know, we're still with Jared, but here he really is an average Joe. He is not a superhero. He is not able to do, you know, anything that Mike Banning can do in the Fallen series, or that Matt Damon can do in the Bourne thing. He's supposed to be someone that is very relatable to us, and a flawed man as well. And I think that's Rick's real talent, that he, you know, we still have the set pieces and we still have the stuff that gives you the thrill. But at the same time, what I've really heard people say who've conveyed it to me personally with Greenland is that they were just really taken back by how sort of real and plausible it felt. I mean, it might also have something, you know, everyone's been stuck at home for a year, and perhaps there's an added poignancy to this movie, you know, some sort of apocalyptic feeling that we might have been sharing. But I think Rick's a bit of a genius when it comes to that. He might call it sort of hiding the peas in the mashed potatoes, that we've still got, you know, we've got an action film, but we've also got a drama, and that neither one should compromise the other in a bad way.
Absolutely. Now, here is a question from James. James Phillips, do you plan on composing music outside of films for live performance?
My mother would love it if I answered yes to this question. I mean, that's why I started writing probably somewhat precociously as after I finished being a choir boy, I spent the rest of my school time and at university sort of writing proper music, whatever that may be. Presumably that means for two instruments and two people playing it and one person in the audience. So I come from a background of writing music that could be considered sort of concert or stage worthy. But I have to say, I mean, when I first moved to LA, I used to get a call from friends who said they're getting married and could I write them a little piece of their marriage. I've probably got half a dozen of those little ditties lying around. I think I've got very used to the process now of seeing a picture on the screen and understanding at least one level of structure from the moving image. I'm not saying that provides the entire structure, because I think it's more complicated than that. But I certainly haven't in the last, God, I don't know how long, thought I just want to write a piece of music because I want to write a piece of music and I want someone to perform it. The only caveat to that is that, going back to the choir stuff, I actually did dig out some of these wedding pieces and various other things, choral pieces, and I am actually going to record them, I think, in about a month. And God knows what I'm going to do with them. But they definitely, would show a part of me which is not writing to picture and just sort of music for music's sake. But it's not, I know there's look, you never go to the Hollywood Bowl with a performance of Nobody. A lot of my scores wouldn't live up to, a sort of Sonnet Lumiere kind of spectacle thing. Perhaps something, the Forbidden Kingdom might, or even Papillon might. But I think, with action stuff, or The Good Wife might do, but it's harder with action scores to sort of segue from their place within a movie to doing something outside of it. But I think I may change my opinion on that as well. I mean, I can see a lot of my colleagues are taking scores to the stage and writing operas and all sorts and symphonies. Maybe I just need to be a little older and wiser. Certainly doing well on the getting older business. Not sure about the wiser.
Well, I would personally love to see Nobody at the Hollywood Bowl. I think it would kick ass out of the same stuff they play over and over. So anyways, Lionel Cohen would love to know, what are some of your weirder, more obscure musical influences?
Well, I think I'm going to sound like I'm sort of banging on about the same old thing with this choir stuff, but when I put my kids to bed at night, at the moment, I try and play. I've got a huge Spotify playlist of I think it's about 2,000 tracks of music written before 1600. Now, it's just as well my kids are falling asleep and sort of barely conscious when I'm playing this. Otherwise, I think they'd take my phone and flush it down the toilet, because it's certainly not the music that they're by daytime they wouldn't choose to listen to it. They're very young, so they don't necessarily have a say. But the reason I'm playing it is because I think there's a sort of fascination to it, especially the earlier back you get. Certainly music from the sort of Middle Ages has almost an alien. I mean, it almost sounds modern. In fact, there's such a sort of tonality hasn't been established yet, certainly in the sense that we know it, and I've always found that evocative, and I think I've always wanted to. I do think I allude to that. I think there are, even in something like Nobody, which sounds like thrashing guitars and pumping drums, there are mannerisms, turns of phrases, and things like that, which I think, well, not only do I think, I sort of know, have a connective sinew with what I'm talking about with this weird world of medieval music. It's not overt. And sometimes it may only be me who notices it, but I think it goes back to the same point I was making earlier, that that the music that got you into music, I think, lives with you, whatever you're doing, whatever you're writing. It's still there, bubbling beneath the surface, and occasionally it might be more obvious than at other times. And also, I think, to answer, I mean, I had my background was that, I mean, my grandfather was Indian, from the subcontinent of India. My mother was a music teacher. My father wasn't particularly musical, but he absolutely loved jazz. so I had, quite, and being brought up in singing in church choirs. So I had this quite eclectic sound, just even as a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, of classical Indian jazz, all sort of floating around me. And I had the good fortune that we had a piano at home, and despite my mum being a music teacher, she never insisted that I played Brahms or Schubert or Bach, which is just as well because I probably couldn't and still can't. But I was just allowed to roam free on the piano. So all those sounds, whether it was Benny Goodman or Artie Shaw or my grandfather's harmonium music from one of his friends, or some opera that my mum may have been singing, they were all living sort of inside my head as a young kid, not knowing what any of it really meant. But when I went onto the piano, I suppose I was just trying to add the 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever things together, and out comes something else. So, and I think to a certain way, I've kept that going throughout my life. I've never really said no to listening to something. I'm always amazed when I stumble across something that beyond what I would consider my comfort zone, and sort of thinking, wow, there's still a world of sounds out there, and musical emotions that one can enjoy.
Now, Tyver Music would love to know what was working on Batman Arkham Knight like. He was particularly impressed with the sound design for it.
Well, it was great. I'm not a gamer. I know it always disappoints people who are gamers when you make that revelation. It's sort of like they feel sort of like you're betraying them, or you're you got into something you shouldn't have really got into. But and it's not out of I really have tried. I've been, when I was working on Call of Duty or Batman, I went to the studios and I played. They gave me a paddle, and now I was absolutely useless. Nothing more to be said about my ability in playing the games. But obviously, I had to invest myself in that world and understand how it was working. And I knew just from reading and talking to friends and colleagues that the Arkham Knight franchise was huge and impressive. Not just that it was big, that it was also very, very, very impressive. And I could see that. I mean, the first talks I had with Nick Arundel, with whom I wrote the score at Warner Brothers, I realized how much passion went into that project. So I felt, really quite sort of privileged to be welcomed into that world. And a bit like Jason Bourne, I have to say, because this was the third one in the Arkham series, there was a palette that had been established and was embraced by the creative people, but I was given some range to move away and try things, and and the sound design that you mentioned, God, when one talks about these old projects, it's really hard to remember everything. What I could tell you something about that project is that I finished my work on it, and I would say there was probably a year after that where the audio team were implementing everything into the game. I may be wrong. I can't quite remember. It was a hell. I'm so used to, in a film, you finish a score, and then there's 2, if you're lucky, 3 weeks on a dub stage where the sound gets finalized and it gets shipped, and in normal times it comes out in theaters. This game, the attention to detail that those guys put into implementing everything, with that complexity as well of the way that cues are built, so the more intense a scene gets within. God, I've forgotten the whole nomenclature for video games. But as you go through levels, sorry, that's the word. And you progress. More the music, an additional layer comes in. I mean, I have to think about that while I'm writing, but the actual implementation of that within the game engine is remarkable. And so I think, obviously, I put a lot of work into it, but there was a whole lot of work that happened after I'd finished and had sort of almost forgotten about the whole project.
Now, you've been quite busy. Tell us what you're up to or what's coming out.
So there was a little film I did at the end of last year called Trees of Peace, which is, it was an important film for me to take on, not by bank manager wouldn't have thought it was important because it basically didn't pay. But it was a movie about the Rwandan genocide, seen from the perspective of 4 women and set almost entirely inside a tiny room beneath a house in Rwanda, and basically hiding from trying to survive atrocities. And I wanted to do it when I was asked about it, just because I felt it was like something I hadn't done before, and that sort of desire to keep moving, to keep relevant, to not feel like I'm, treading water. And also, I gravitate towards, if I'm just as a punter watching a movie, if I'm looking through Netflix or Amazon or whatever, I will probably go for probably a more somber tone in the films that I like watching. And you don't get much more somber than genocide. And also I like the challenge of how do you score a movie that's set inside of one room. It was like an interesting one to try and figure out, because I knew sure as hell this is not going to be about, let's hire a big orchestra. In fact, it's the absolute opposite. How do we feel this intimacy in the room and really share the experience that these women are going through? So it's a very independent movie. There's no one famous in it, as far as I'm aware. I certainly don't recognize anyone. But I found it a really useful, and I'm so glad that I did it and that I had the opportunity to do it. I'm not quite sure whether, I think they're just trying to find a home for that right now. And then I've got, just at the moment, I've got returns of 2 shows I've been doing. The Good Fight, which is the evolution of The Good Wife, is just about to start its 5th season. Well, it has started. I'm just about to join the gang, which will basically mean, if I add that to The Good Wife, which was 7 seasons, so this is sort of the 12th season of things goodish for me, which which is, I have to say, when that stops and that comes to an end, it's going to feel very odd, because I can't imagine I'm never going to have a run like that on any other project. I mean, it seems sort of remarkable to me that we're all still talking to each other. Sorry, you're going to say something then?
Oh no. Well, I mean, what to me, what's almost really significant, even beyond Nobody being a great movie, is that it really is essentially the first "we're going back to the movies" movie, at least in America. It did #1, got great reviews, and again, it's kind of like after everyone essentially, being in the cave. This is the movie that people are really going safely, hopefully, back to the theaters with. What's that just like for you to know that you're kind of aiding in this redawning of the film going experience?
Well, it's gratifying, and it's also gratifying to see that the critics like it, broadly speaking, and that people have gone to see it, as you say. I hope safely, and that people are getting a kick out of it. And I think I think it's a testament to, because I think it could appeal to. I don't think it's just the sort of shoot 'em up crowd who could watch this movie, although I think they'll absolutely get what they want. I think there is some, without trying to overstate it, I do think there's some complexity in the film. I think there's some quirkiness as well. I mean, like, who the hell is this brother exactly? What is the story there? And I like the fact that it's not just sort of neat. There is this, I think Ilya's brought this slightly sort of Russian sensibility. I always remember with Russian classical composers, I remember being taught this, that there's with a lot of the Russian classical composers, you sort of feel like, oh yeah, that's classical music, and then they just do something a little bit weird that you don't quite expect. And I think Ilya brings that as well, that there are just some oddities within here, which I think are fun. It makes it just different from similar films of this genre. And I'm sure that, apart from anything else, for people who have been stuck at home for a year, and we've all been feeling it, some sort of pent-up frustration in some way or other, varying degrees. But I think, that you see Hutch get his kicks and get his revenge and fulfill the sort of promise from his old life. I think we can all slightly revel in that, whatever your take is on violence and gratuitous violence. There's no harm in it. It kind of lets us, it permits us to vicariously sort of enjoy Hutch's letting off some steam, which is probably a good thing, and probably better Hutch does it than we do it.
Yeah. I mean, I guess for my last question to you, I mean, in a way, your score kind of helped to kick off the intensity and the psychoticness that everyone felt during the pandemic with Unhinged, which was a totally music concrete score. One of these movies that kind of captured this enraged zeitgeist. And now, in a way, you're leading us out of this with a really fun kind of feel good about ultraviolence movie. What do you think, though, this says about just how versatile you are in the action genre?
Well, that's a really interesting point. I didn't think of it like that because Unhinged is not a fun film. I mean, I suppose that there's a moment at the end where here's your courtesy tap, which is quite I certainly remember the first time I saw that, just before Russell Crowe gets his comeuppance. But and it is music concrete. I mean, it's dirty, it's filthy score, and hopefully in the best sense of the two words. I mean, so much so that I was sort of, when it was suggested a soundtrack came out, I said, "Are you sure anyone would want to listen to that?" Because it's it really was intended for this movie, and I was like, "No, let's put a soundtrack out." But there is a greater sense of I think things are heightened in Nobody. I think we're given permission to enjoy this in a different way. In terms of me, I don't. It's an interesting one, Dan. You mean I don't necessarily think of myself, going back to my analysis of Harry and his versatility. I mean, I'd hope to think that, especially if you compare the sort of somewhat, elegant, I would like to think, writing that I do within The Good Wife and The Good Fight, that I enjoy having that range within my working environment. So I'm really grateful that I'm able to add my abilities to action movies, especially interesting ones. But I don't think I'd ever want to do that exclusively. But it's fun to be part of what's been a miserable time, a terrible time for so many people. But if either or any of these films we've mentioned, especially the ones that have come out during this period, have given people, whether it's from the sort of humanity of Greenland, the wretchedness of Unhinged, and the heightened almost absurdity of Nobody, obviously I feel privileged to be a part of it, and that people put their trust in me to contribute. And the one thing I will say, actually, is interesting with Nobody, because I mentioned I'm not a guitarist. So I had this great friend of mine called Andy Page who played guitar and bass on it, and it was quite fun as a non-guitarist trying to explain, because if it's the riffs that he was playing, that was kind of easy, because I could play that. I had the version of that, but there's some really angry bits, and I was sort of saying to Andy, I can just remember, he lives in Australia, and I was sort of singing just sort of this horrible kind of angular sort of blood-curdling sound. I said, "Can you do that on the guitar?" He's, "What do you mean, man?" And then he sort of plays something. I said, "Yeah, but more." So it was really interesting. I mean, I suppose in a sense I was letting out some anger, and Andy was then playing his version of my anger down the Zoom to me, and then we keep trying, and then we got it. So it was, I suppose it was. Funnily enough, probably quite a therapeutic thing for me to write. I've never really written a guitar score like this before, so I think it not only did it tick a box for me, I think it also provided some kind of therapy as well, and I got paid for it. So
that's always a good thing. Well, Nobody rocks, man. David, Buckley, and to our audience, I want to say thank you so much for joining us at Film Music Live. I want you to watch Nobody in movie theaters and soon on video on demand, with David Buckley's soundtrack available on Backlot Music. And thanks to our producer, Dale Turner, Kathy Ng, Mark Northam, Dan Goldwasser at Scoring Sessions, and Nikki Walsh at Backlot Music. And I'll be seeing you all Monday, April 5th at 5 p.m. when Marco Beltrami and Brandon Roberts join Psychic Forces to talk about chaos walking. David, stay angry in all the best musical ways. And we'll see you all. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.